Jungkook's mother breaks her silence, revealing how public pressure is tearing Jungkook and Taehyung apart. A deeply emotional truth unfolds behind the spotlight. "Stop lying to the world, both of you are not okay." Her voice cracked, trembling as if holding a truth too heavy to carry alone. The television was still blaring a replay of the awards night, but the room had gone unbearably still. Jungkook's mother stood in the living room of her own home, her eyes red, her voice raw, as reporters' voices echoed from the screen. She looked at her son with both worry and something deeper, something like betrayal. Jungkook didn't answer right away. His hands were clenched around his phone, knuckles white, the message from Taehyung still glowing on the screen. "They think we're okay. Let them." It wasn't meant to hurt, but it did, because hiding had become survival. Smiling had become armor, and silence, their cruel agreement. Across town, Taehyung stood at the edge of his balcony, looking out at a city that never slept, its lights flickering like camera flashes. He hated balconies. Too exposed, too high, too symbolic. And yet, it was the only place he could breathe. Inside, his team was dissecting his every move from last night, why he hadn't stood next to Jungkook, why he hesitated before smiling, why his voice cracked when someone asked, "Are you two still close?" Taehyung didn't answer then. He didn't answer now, because the answer wasn't simple. The truth was, neither of them had asked for the pressure that came with every glance, every handshake, every breath they shared in public. They didn't ask to be turned into a myth, into something the world clung to. But the world had taken them anyway, stitched them into headlines, edited them into moments they never agreed to, painted them into something they couldn't recognize anymore. Back at the house, Jungkook's mother finally sat down, exhausted. She wasn't crying anymore. She had cried enough. Years ago, when Jungkook came home and couldn't sleep for nights because one look from a reporter felt like a spotlight straight through his chest. Or when Taehyung would visit, and the silence between them was so loud she felt she could drown in it. "They don't see the bruises on your silence," she said softly, almost to herself. "They only see the choreography." Jungkook looked up. His face was unreadable, but inside something cracked. He remembered when Taehyung used to laugh so hard at night that their neighbors would bang on the walls. He remembered the long drives, the jokes, the promises. Now, every word between them had to pass through layers of caution, like walking barefoot over glass. The next morning, the headlines changed. Jungkook's mother speaks out. They are under too much pressure. The fans reacted instantly. Some with sympathy, others with denial, and some with rage. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out, and it had come from someone who wasn't playing a role. Not a manager, not a company, but a mother, a witness. Taehyung turned off his phone. The notifications were unbearable. He didn't need anyone to tell him what was being said. He could feel it. The air had shifted. The illusion was cracking. And for the first time in months, he called Jungkook. No texts, no handlers, just him. Just the raw, beating truth between them. Jungkook answered on the first ring. Neither spoke at first. The silence wasn't hostile, it was human. "I saw what your mom said," Taehyung murmured finally. "I didn't ask her to," Jungkook replied. "But I'm glad she did." The confession hung in the air like incense, slow, heavy, sacred. "She's not wrong," Taehyung whispered. "We're carrying too much." Jungkook's laugh was tired. "We were never built for this. Not like this." And there it was. The first step. Not a solution, not a plan, but honesty. Later that week, they walked into rehearsal together, not for show, not for damage control, but because pretending apart hurt more than struggling together. They didn't hug for the cameras. They didn't speak for the microphones. But when they stood beside each other again on stage, something shifted. Not in the world, but in them. Because sometimes, healing doesn't look like applause. Sometimes, it looks like quiet courage. Like a mother's trembling voice on national TV. Like two friends remembering they were human before they were legends. And in that moment, The pressure didn't disappear, but it finally had a name, and it was no longer theirs to carry alone. The meeting room was dimly lit, the flickering projector casting long, uneasy shadows on the walls as the team debriefed the press fallout. Jungkook sat at the far end of the table, jaw tense, eyes lowered not because he wasn't listening, but because the noise in his own head had grown louder than the people around him. Every word from his mother had triggered something he had spent years trying to suppress. Not shame, not fear, but truth. And truth, in a world built on curated perfection, was dangerous. "Do you want us to release a statement?" one of the hype reps asked carefully, their voice treading on thin ice. No. The answer came before Jungkook even looked up. Firm. Final. No more statements, no more pretending. The silence that followed was thicker than smoke. Even Namjoon, seated next to him with his fingers interlaced, didn't try to interject. He understood. He had watched Jungkook evolve from the wide-eyed trainee into a man both adored and scrutinized by millions, and he knew this moment was a crack in the dam. Meanwhile, across the city, Taehyung stood in front of his mirror, a black turtleneck half hanging from his shoulders, his phone still on the call screen with no words exchanged. He had ended the conversation with Jungkook only minutes ago, and yet the weight of it lingered like perfume on his skin, a strange mixture of relief and ache. He remembered the first time he met Jungkook's mother, the way she had smiled at him not as a celebrity, but as a boy who made her son laugh when the world seemed too heavy. She would bake things for them during their trainee days. Mostly muffins that were too sweet, but always warm, always comforting. And now, she had been the one to break the silence they had built around themselves. He slipped the sweater on and reached for his coat. His schedule was packed, another photo shoot, another staged smile, but something inside him stirred restlessly. He no longer wanted to smile for the camera, if it meant erasing the truth behind his eyes. Jungkook didn't go home that night. Instead, he wandered through the empty corridors of the practice studio, footsteps echoing like memories. He ended up in one of the smaller rooms, the kind where they used to rehearse late into the night just for fun, just because they loved it, before everything became a performance. He sat on the floor, head resting back against the wall, breathing in the silence. He remembered Taehyung laughing here. He remembered sitting shoulder to shoulder after long days, sharing earbuds and joking about who would mess up choreography first. He remembered dreams, not headlines. A soft knock startled him. The door opened just a little. It was Yoongi. "I figured you'd be here," he said, stepping in with 2 bottled waters in hand. Jungkook accepted one without a word. "You all right?" Jungkook hesitated, then gave a faint shake of his head. "No, but I think I'm done pretending I am." Yoongi sat beside him, crossing his legs. "Good, that's a start." They didn't talk much after that. They didn't have to. Sometimes, the loudest healing comes in silence. Meanwhile, Taehyung was halfway through a photo shoot when he noticed his hands trembling ever so slightly. The stylist mistook it for fatigue. He didn't correct her, but inside he knew what it was. The illusion had started to crumble, and for the first time, he wasn't interested in rebuilding it. After the shoot, he walked alone down the streets of Seoul, hoodie up, mask on, but for once not to hide from the fans. This time, he was hiding from the version of himself that always smiled, always posed, always said the right thing. He found himself in front of Jungkook's childhood apartment, the one with the worn-down gate and the little patch of garden his mother used to fuss over. He hadn't been here in years. The nostalgia hit him like a wave. He didn't knock. He didn't even plan to be seen. But the door opened anyway. His heart skipped. Jungkook's mother stood there, eyes tired but kind. "I thought you might come," she said simply, and moved aside to let him in. Inside, nothing had changed. The same photos on the wall, the same mismatched mugs, the same scent of home. She sat him down at the kitchen table, poured him tea. No cameras, no expectations, just a mother and a boy who used to be like a second son. "I'm sorry," Taehyung said quietly. "For what?" "For not being there more. For not calling. For letting everything become so loud." She looked at him, really looked at him, then reached over and covered his hand with hers. "You've always been there, even when you're not." And I know how hard it is to carry the world's hopes on your shoulders while your heart is breaking. Taehyung's throat tightened. You and Jungkook, you need to stop carrying this alone. He nodded, unable to find the words. But the warmth of her hand stayed with him long after he left. Later that night, a clip from an old variety show went viral again. It was a moment where Taehyung and Jungkook had been playfully bickering, laughing uncontrollably, falling into each other like the world didn't matter. Fans flooded the comments with longing. We miss this, they wrote. We miss times. Them asterisk. But they didn't know. Behind the scenes, the laughter had come at a cost. The closeness had been scrutinized, dissected, questioned by press, fans, even management. They were told to tone it down, to protect the brand, to remember their image. What no one remembered was that Jungkook and Taehyung weren't Times Images asterisk. They were people. That weekend, without notice, both of them walked into a private radio studio they had used once before years ago. No live feed, no promotion, just one mic, 2 chairs. Let's talk, Jungkook said. Taehyung nodded. Let's not filter. And they spoke. About pressure, about loneliness, about love, not the romanticized version, but the real one. The kind that bruises and heals and complicates. The kind that exists between two people who have been through storms together, only to find themselves in different boats without knowing how. They didn't name names, they didn't point fingers, but they were honest. Brutally so. The conversation leaked. Not the audio, but the existence of it. A staff member had mentioned it in a forum. Fans exploded with curiosity. What had they said? Why now? But Jungkook and Taehyung didn't give them an answer. Not yet. Instead, they returned to practice, together, side by side. It wasn't perfect. They weren't pretending it was. But it was real. And sometimes, real was enough to begin again. The studio smelled like sweat, dust, and faint traces of lavender from someone's leftover fabric spray on the mic foam. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't staged. But it was safe. That's why Jungkook had chosen it. And that's why Taehyung had followed. They didn't speak much when they entered. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy with anticipation, like the seconds before a concert when the lights dim and everyone inhales but no one exhales. Jungkook adjusted the stool with a creak, then sat, his fingers trailing across the cold surface of the mic stand before steadying it. Taehyung, always slightly more elegant in his discomfort, took his time folding his coat, placing it gently on the chair beside him before sitting down. Their eyes met briefly, just long enough to acknowledge that what they were about to do mattered. No script, no team, no cameras, just their voices, raw and unfiltered, recorded not for content, but for clarity, for closure, for healing. Jungkook leaned in first. His voice, when it came, was low, not from hesitation, but from the weight of everything it carried. I don't know when we started pretending, he began, but I think it was when silence became easier than explaining. Taehyung inhaled slowly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. I remember how it used to be, how we'd say anything, jokes, stories, dreams. There was no filter, no calculation, just us. But then, Jungkook's voice caught. He let it hang, unfinished, because some truths didn't need completing. Taehyung's voice, when it joined, was quieter but steadier. It's not that I stopped trusting you, he said. It's that I didn't trust what the world would do with our truth. Outside the soundproof walls, the city roared with its usual chaos. But inside, time slowed. The microphone crackled faintly, catching every breath, every shift in tone, every fragment of vulnerability. I was scared, Jungkook admitted. Not of you, of losing you, of the weight we'd both carry if we kept walking this path as if it didn't burn. Taehyung nodded. I felt it too. Every smile we forced, every shoulder brush we avoided just in case a photo got taken, it killed me a little. Jungkook looked at him, really looked at him. And in that moment there was no idol and no industry. Just two boys who had grown up too fast, had become symbols before they could finish becoming people. Do you think we could have done it differently? Taehyung asked, his eyes softer than they'd been in months. I don't know, Jungkook whispered, but I think we can start now. The recording went on for hours. They talked about everything: the early years, the pressure to be perfect, the shift from being friends to being figures, and the silent toll it had taken. They laughed too over silly memories, over the way fans thought they hated each other when in reality, they were just tired of hurting each other quietly. When they finally stopped, the sun had dipped beneath the skyline. Neither had touched their phones. Neither had looked at the clock. It wasn't about content, it was about catharsis. Outside the building, a small group of fans had gathered, unaware of what was unfolding inside. One held a sign that read, "We still believe in Taekook." Another held her phone up, live streaming, nothing but the empty street, praying for a glimpse of something real. But the most real part wasn't on the sidewalk. It was in the quiet nod Jungkook gave Taehyung as they stepped outside. It was in the way Taehyung's shoulder brushed Jungkook's and neither flinched. It was in the way they didn't speak, but their steps fell in sync as they walked to the car. Later that week, Hybe released a brief statement, not to deny the rumors or spin the headlines, but to support the truth. "We stand by our artists as individuals and as brothers," it read. "We support their right to heal, to grow, and to be honest about the challenges they face behind the scenes." The recent discussion between Jungkook and Taehyung was not an official release. It was a private moment shared in trust. We ask fans and media to respect that trust. The fans, surprisingly, did. For once, there were no trending hashtags demanding explanations. Instead, a quiet understanding swept across fandom spaces. Edits slowed, conspiracy theories paused, and in their place, messages of love poured in. "I don't care if they're together or not," one fan posted. "I just want them to be happy, to be times free. Asterisk." In the following days, Jungkook and Taehyung were seen together again, not in promotional shoots, but in candid, quiet moments. A coffee run, a late-night walk, a shared umbrella. The world didn't stop turning. The cameras didn't stop flashing. But something fundamental had shifted. Freedom was no longer a distant idea. It was now a practice. And they were beginning, one step at a time. Jungkook visited his mother again the following weekend. This time, he brought Taehyung. She didn't say anything dramatic. No lectures, no heavy words. She simply hugged them both, cooked way too much food, and made them sit at the kitchen table like she used to. "You boys look tired," she said, sliding over a bowl of hot soup. "Eat, you're safe here." Taehyung's smile was small but real. "Thank you for saying what we couldn't." She squeezed his hand. "You didn't need to. I already knew." And for the first time in a long time, they both felt like sons again. That night, Jungkook and Taehyung sat on the roof of the apartment, legs dangling over the edge, watching the stars blur behind the haze of city lights. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't need to define anything. The world could keep guessing. Let them. What mattered was the peace between them. A peace earned. A peace chosen. And for now, that was enough. The night sky over Seoul was unusually clear, a rare moment where the stars seemed to blink back through the pollution and haze. On the rooftop of Jungkook's childhood apartment, the silence stretched not because there was nothing left to say, but because sometimes presence was louder than words. Taehyung leaned back against the concrete wall, his jacket pulled up around his neck as the winter chill nipped at their skin. Beside him, Jungkook sipped slowly from a lukewarm can of coffee, the heat long gone, but the comfort still lingering. "Do you remember the first time we performed as BTS?" Taehyung's voice broke the quiet, low and nostalgic. Jungkook smiled faintly without turning. "Yeah, I thought I was going to pass out. You kept hitting my shoulder backstage to get me to stop shaking. You were shaking so hard I thought your mic would fall off." Taehyung chuckled. There was warmth in the memory, but also a pang, because that was when it was simple, when fear was just about getting the steps right and singing on key, not about living up to the world's impossible expectations. Not about headlines dissecting every glance. Not about having to choose between privacy and presence. I miss being unknown sometimes, Jungkook admitted. Taehyung nodded slowly. Back then, we were just boys with dreams. Now, we're symbols. And symbols aren't allowed to crack. Jungkook set the coffee can down and looked out over the rooftops. But we did. We cracked. And maybe we needed to. Maybe it's the only way to be real again. Taehyung didn't respond immediately. His gaze dropped to his hands that had held microphones, signed autographs, gripped Jungkook's wrist in silent panic behind the stage curtain, held back tears during encores. I used to think that if we kept quiet long enough, the world would stop watching, he said. But the silence made them watch harder. They turned it into a mystery, Jungkook whispered, into fan wars, into clickbait. And we let it happen. Taehyung finally turned to him, his voice softer now. But we're not letting it anymore. We're reclaiming this. Jungkook met his eyes. And in that brief moment, it wasn't about careers or rumors or the machine they'd become entangled in. It was about them, as people, as brothers, as something deeper than what could be reduced into shipping names or reaction videos. The next morning, they were already trending. A blurry photo had surfaced two figures on a rooftop, silhouettes recognizable even in the grainy pixels. The caption read, "Taekook spotted last night. Are they back?" Neither of them commented. Instead, they returned to their routines. Slowly, carefully, reclaiming their own narrative through action, not statements. When they arrived at dance rehearsal the next day, side by side, the room felt different, not tense, not cautious, just quieter, observing, curious. Yoongi gave them a nod. Jimin raised an eyebrow and smirked. Namjoon didn't say anything, just smiled knowingly, like he had been waiting for this reset all along. They practiced together, and it felt right. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. They stumbled once or twice, bumping shoulders. They laughed. And that laughter, caught by a behind-the-scenes camera, would later become the most replayed moment of the week. The fans didn't need explanations. Not anymore. Hybe's board, however, wasn't as silent. Behind closed doors, discussions raged about optics, brand value, emotional leverage. There were those who argued that the company should capitalize on the moment, reignite the Taekook narrative to drive engagement. Others, particularly those who had seen the toll firsthand, argued for protection, for boundaries, for space. Jungkook and Taehyung sat in on one of those meetings. They didn't have to, but they chose to. "We're not products," Jungkook said firmly, when one executive suggested a surprise dual live session for engagement metrics. "We're people," Taehyung added, voice cool but cutting. "And we're not here to perform our friendship." That meeting ended earlier than expected. No decisions were made, but a line had been drawn, and for once, they were the ones drawing it. That night, Jungkook returned home and sat at the piano in the corner of his living room. His fingers moved slowly across the keys, not playing a song, just letting sound find its way out. Music had always been his safest language, the one that spoke even when his throat couldn't. His phone buzzed. A message from Taehyung. "Come to the studio. I'm working on something." Without replying, Jungkook grabbed his coat and keys and left. At the studio, Taehyung was hunched over the mixing board, headphones around his neck, a new track looping on the speakers. It was raw, unfinished, but something about it gripped Jungkook immediately. A low, pulsing rhythm layered with delicate strings. No vocals yet, just emotion, pulsing like a heartbeat. "I want us to finish this together," Taehyung said without looking at him. "Not for release, just for us." Jungkook stepped closer, listening again. Then he nodded. They worked all night, layering melodies, exchanging ideas, not worrying about structure or length or marketability, just expression. At one point, Taehyung hummed the line, soft, almost broken. Jungkook repeated it, added harmony, and suddenly, something clicked. The track became a confession. Not to fans, not to anyone else. To each other. When the sun rose, they exported the file and titled it simply December. They never posted it, never teased it, but it lived on both their phones, a reminder of what mattered. Days turned to weeks. The noise outside continued. News outlets speculated, fans debated, but the storm no longer touched the center. Jungkook's mother invited them both over again for dinner. This time, Jimin and Yoongi joined too. It was loud, full of laughter, and homemade kimchi that burned just right. At one point, Taehyung helped wash the dishes, sleeves rolled up, while Jungkook dried. Their mother watched them from the kitchen door, a smile tugging at her lips. "You two," she said. "You were never meant to walk this road alone. I'm glad you're finding your way back." They looked at her, then at each other, and didn't say a word. Because some truths are already understood. As spring approached, they began preparing for the group's next project. The theme was resilience. Fitting. Their creative input was more personal this time. They wrote lyrics that didn't hide behind metaphor. They chose visuals that didn't aim to dazzle but to reveal. One song tentatively titled Unseen was a duet. Jungkook and Taehyung, side by side in the recording booth, took turns singing verses about silence, pressure, and the quiet strength of being truly seen. The chorus, when they sang it together, felt like a conversation finally completed. When the teaser dropped weeks later, fans around the world cried. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was time's true asterisk. And truth, no matter how quietly sung, echoes louder than any scream. For the first time in years, both Jungkook and Taehyung posted photos without filters, without curated captions. Just a photo of them backstage, arms slung casually over each other's shoulders. No hashtags, no explanation. The comments flooded in. "We missed this. They look happy again. Whatever it is, I'm just glad they're okay." Because in the end, that's all anyone really wanted, for them to be okay. And finally, they were. Not perfect, not healed completely, but walking forward, together.
Under the sharp morning light, the city was alive again. Honking cars, flashing billboards, rushing footsteps. But for Jungkook and Taehyung, the noise no longer reached the same places it once did. There was still pressure, still expectations, still millions watching their every step, but now the two of them were anchored in something deeper than survival. After all the distance, confusion, tension, and public speculation, they had found their way back to something real, not a performance, not a brand, but a connection forged in years of struggle, triumph, and shared silence. In the days following the teaser release for Unseen, the world seemed to pause. Fans across continents poured their emotions online, some in tears, others in disbelief. They weren't reacting to a comeback, not really. They were reacting to the vulnerability in Jungkook and Taehyung's voices, the lyrics that didn't try to hide pain but embraced it. The fans had known something was wrong for a long time, but now they finally had the unspoken confirmation. And the beauty of it was, it didn't feel like a publicity stunt. It felt like two souls speaking to each other across a battlefield. Behind the scenes, however, the emotions ran deeper. The release of Unseen had been met with internal resistance. The song didn't fit the usual formula. There was no choreography, no beat drop, no explosion of color. It was stripped down to vocals and piano, to raw harmony and layered emotion. But Jungkook and Taehyung had been adamant. This song wasn't just a track. It was a reconciliation. It was a decision to be honest not just with the world but with themselves. One evening, a week before the full album was set to drop, they met again at the studio. No managers, no cameras, just them and the quiet hum of the equipment still running from the day's session. "I still think about what your mom said," Taehyung murmured as he settled into the old, worn sofa by the window. Jungkook, hunched over the mixing desk, didn't look up, but his fingers paused. "Which part?" "That we were carrying too much, that we were cracking silently." Jungkook exhaled slowly and turned to him. "We didn't know how to not carry it. It became normal." Taehyung's eyes were distant, but it was. We were surviving, not living. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was reflective, gentle. Jungkook got up and sat across from him, elbows on his knees. You know, I used to think if we just stayed quiet long enough, the world would get tired and look away. Taehyung gave a sad smile, but they never did. They never will, Jungkook said, but maybe now we don't have to disappear to breathe. Taehyung nodded, we just have to stop lying. The studio door creaked open then and Jimin peeked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. I figured you guys would still be here, he said, stepping in without waiting for a response. I saw the lights from the hallway. They shared a grin. There was something about Jimin's presence that always softened the edges. He sat beside Taehyung, handing over the coffee, then turned to Jungkook. I listened to the final version of Unseen. Jungkook looked at him curiously, and Jimin's eyes glistened. It felt like healing, not just for you two, for all of us. The moment hung in the air. Taehyung blinked slowly, his fingers tightening around the cup. That's what we hoped for. Jimin leaned back, stretching his legs out. I think people forget that this group, this brotherhood, it wasn't always smooth. But what made it strong wasn't perfection. It was the fact that we kept choosing each other. Jungkook glanced at Taehyung again, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard, Taehyung replied. Later that night, as Jimin left and the room grew quiet again, Jungkook pulled up a beat on the system. It was unfinished, just a melody he'd been humming for days. Taehyung listened, eyes closed, swaying slightly with the rhythm. Then with a sudden spark he began humming too. The sounds blended effortlessly, the years of musical synergy between them igniting again like a long-forgotten flame. No words, just sound, expression, memory. They worked on the track until dawn. It wasn't meant for the album. It wasn't meant for anyone else. It was just for them. A week later, the album dropped. And the world listened. Unseen shot to the top of global charts within hours. Critics called it raw, unfiltered, a departure from industry polish. Fans called it the song we didn't know we needed. The music video, a black and white single shot of Taehyung and Jungkook sitting back-to-back in an empty room, was minimalist, vulnerable, and devastatingly intimate. But beyond the numbers, beyond the reaction videos and editorials, something more important happened. The narrative changed. The media no longer speculated about their distance with sensational headlines. Now, they talked about resilience, about honesty, about 2 young men refusing to let fame erase who they were. At a live press conference held days after the release, Jungkook and Taehyung sat side by side. No stylist had touched their hair in hours. Their faces were bare, real. A journalist stood and asked, "What made you finally decide to share this story?" Jungkook looked at Taehyung, then back at the crowd. "Because we were tired of pretending." Taehyung added, "Because silence was becoming a prison." Another asked, "Do you worry about how this affects your brand?" Taehyung smiled gently. "We're not brands, we're people." Jungkook leaned into the mic, "And people deserve to be honest." The room went silent. And then applause. Not the polite kind, but the real kind. The kind that echoed with understanding. That night the group gathered privately in Namjoon's apartment. Yoongi brought whiskey. J-Hope brought snacks. Jin joined through video call. There was laughter, there were toasts, but mostly there was relief. Later, as the room thinned out and the music faded into background noise, Taehyung and Jungkook stepped out onto the balcony. The air was crisp. The city buzzed below, uncaring and chaotic, but above the sky remained wide, open, forgiving. Jungkook looked out, eyes thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever be fully free?" Taehyung didn't answer right away. He tilted his head back, watching a plane blink slowly across the stars. "Maybe freedom isn't about escaping the spotlight," he said. "Maybe it's about refusing to let it blind you." Jungkook smiled. "Maybe it's about standing in it together." They stood in silence again, not because there was nothing to say, but because they had finally said everything that mattered. And the world somehow felt a little quieter, a little softer. And for the first time in a long time, so did they. The wind shifted as Taehyung leaned against the railing, a low hum stuck in his throat, barely louder than the city breathing beneath them. Jungkook was silent beside him, head lowered slightly, fingers tapping rhythmically against the glass he was holding. The night around them was neither peaceful nor hostile, it simply existed like they did in that moment. No expectations, no cameras. Just breath and memory, and the fragile rebuilding of something they almost lost. They didn't speak for a long while, and they didn't need to. The comfort of proximity had returned, not the forced closeness of coordinated appearances or PR engagements, but the unspoken understanding that had once been their native language. Inside, Namjoon had turned on a quieter playlist. The rest of the members were sprawled across the apartment like a family after a long, difficult reunion, worn out, but warmer than they'd been in months. Jin was still on the video call, cracking dry jokes that made Jimin roll onto the carpet, wheezing with laughter. Yoongi had nodded off on the armrest of the couch, whiskey glass untouched. When Taehyung finally looked at Jungkook, it was with a weightless kind of vulnerability. His voice was quiet but certain. "I almost left." Jungkook turned toward him slowly. "Left what?" "The group, the country, everything." The confession didn't sting, it settled like dust. Heavy, inevitable. Jungkook didn't flinch. Instead, he asked the question Taehyung had never allowed himself to be asked. "When?" "During the first months of the silence," Taehyung replied. "When things between us, when I couldn't even look at you during shows." Jungkook nodded. "I knew, I think I always knew." Taehyung's gaze didn't waver. "But I couldn't do it, because even when I hated everything, when I hated myself, I still believed in you. I just stopped believing in us." Jungkook looked down at his hands, voice low. "And I stopped believing I was allowed to hold on." There was no melodrama in their words, just sorrow, grief. Two people mourning the friendship they had once nurtured like it was a secret garden and watched it rot under stadium lights. But then slowly, carefully, Taehyung reached out and placed his hand over Jungkook's. He didn't squeeze, he didn't speak, he just stayed. And that was more healing than anything spoken. The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet, despite the global wave Unseen continued to make. Interviews were turned down. Variety shows were skipped. Neither of them explained anything, nor offered more content. For once, they let the silence serve them instead of punish them. Behind closed doors, however, something was blossoming again. They began writing more, not with deadlines, not with producers, just the two of them, nights with dim lights and unfinished melodies, lyrics scratched into notepads, laughter filling the gaps between verses. Their private sessions became sacred. Every week, one of them would bring coffee or snacks, the other would show up with a new riff or a vocal idea. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about rebuilding what had almost been destroyed. During one of those late sessions, Jungkook sang a line that made Taehyung freeze. "You never left, you just became quieter than the crowd." Taehyung stared at him. "Did you write that for me?" Jungkook shrugged. "I wrote it about you, not for you, there's a difference." Taehyung sat down, overwhelmed. "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in years." They added the line into a song they never named. They didn't plan to release it. It existed for them and no one else. A quiet monument to the understanding that came too late and yet still just in time. In the background of all this, the world kept turning. BTS prepared for their next stage performance, their first group show since the emotional reckoning between Taehyung and Jungkook had spilled across every fan forum and news outlet. The night of the performance arrived like a storm held behind a curtain. They stood backstage, lights dimmed, fans roaring like thunder just beyond the thin black veil. Taehyung adjusted his in-ear. Jungkook rolled his shoulders out. Their eyes met, and in that brief glance was an unspoken vow. No more hiding. As the lights flared and the stage opened, they walked out together, not side by side on cue, but side by side because it was natural again. The performance began with a bang of choreography, synchronized as ever, but it was the ballad near the end that changed everything. It was a song Taehyung had written years ago, one they never got to perform because it was deemed too slow, too introspective, not on brand. Tonight, they had fought to include it, and when the first chords played, the stadium fell eerily quiet. Jungkook stepped forward to sing the first verse. His voice was raw, emotional, not pitch-perfect but devastatingly real. Taehyung followed, his tone smooth, tremulous at the edges. The camera caught them standing only a breath apart as they sang to each other, not just for the crowd. Their hands brushed once. Fans screamed, but they didn't pull away. And when the song ended, the silence that followed was louder than the applause. It was the sound of a world realizing this was not performance. This was memory, pain, reconciliation, and truth in harmony. After the show, as they sat backstage with towels around their necks and bottles of water half drunk in their hands, neither of them spoke right away. But Jungkook eventually turned to Taehyung and smiled, tired but clear-eyed. "You know what I realized tonight?" "What?" "We didn't need to be louder to be heard. We just needed to stop whispering to survive." Taehyung leaned back, laughing softly. "That's poetic for someone who used to solve everything with silence and abs." Jungkook chuckled, and the sound was warm and free. For the first time in years, they were no longer trapped in curated versions of themselves. They were simply Jungkook and Taehyung again. And that, above everything, was more than enough. The sun was rising when they finally left the venue, slipping out the back under the watchful eyes of security. A black van waited, but they didn't get in right away. Instead, they stood on the sidewalk, wind ruffling their hair, the city waking around them. Jungkook looked at Taehyung and without overthinking it said, "Let's walk." They strolled through the empty streets of Seoul as the sky bled gold. No masks, no caps, just two friends once broken, now healing. People passed them but didn't stop. Some noticed, most didn't, and for once that was okay. As they crossed the Han River Bridge, Taehyung reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was the photo from their rookie year, the one where they stood side by side, messy hair and oversized jackets, laughing so hard the camera had blurred their faces. "I kept this," he said, handing it to Jungkook, "all these years." Jungkook held the photo gently, staring at the frozen laughter. "Let's take another one," he said. They stopped, turned to the sunrise, and raised their phones. No filters, no captions. Just a new memory. Click. And with that simple sound, a new chapter began. The morning air was laced with the scent of blooming magnolias and damp concrete, the kind of smell that only arrives in those hushed, golden hours when the city hasn't yet decided to wake fully. Taehyung walked a few steps ahead, hands in his pockets, the collar of his jacket turned up against the cold. Jungkook followed silently, phone in hand, glancing down at the freshly taken photo that now lived in his gallery. A quiet, unfiltered reminder that this moment had happened, that they had made it through the fire. No words had passed between them since that click, and yet there was no tension. Only the calm after a storm, the gentle stillness that comes when everything that needed to be broken already had been, and what remained was something that could finally breathe. As they turned down a side street toward a small cafe they had once visited years ago, back when BTS was still a whisper, not a roar, Taehyung spoke without looking back. "I dreamt about that night again." Jungkook didn't ask which night. He knew, the night everything fractured. "I was standing at the edge of the stage," Taehyung continued, "and you were behind me, but when I turned around you were walking the other way. I couldn't call out, my voice," he paused. "It didn't exist." Jungkook's breath caught. I had that dream too, he said softly, but in mine you looked back, and I was the one who couldn't move. They stopped walking. The street was quiet. A truck rumbled a block away, and the wind stirred faint echoes between buildings. But in that moment, all that existed was the space between them. Taehyung turned slowly. His expression was unreadable, too much emotion etched across too many memories. I never stopped caring, Jungkook. I know, Jungkook whispered, but we forgot how to show it. Taehyung took a small step forward. Do you ever wonder how different it could have been if we weren't so afraid of being watched? All the time. A small smile tugged at Taehyung's lips, and the lines near his eyes softened. I think maybe we needed to break, so we could choose each other again. They resumed walking, this time closer. Their shoulders brushed occasionally, but neither pulled away. The cafe was still there, tucked between a bookstore and an apartment complex, its windows foggy from the warmth inside. A bell chimed as they stepped through the door, and an elderly woman behind the counter glanced up, recognition flickering in her eyes. She said nothing, simply nodded and motioned to their usual booth by the window. It felt like a memory had opened its arms and welcomed them home. They ordered quietly, Americano for Jungkook, Earl Grey for Taehyung. The silence between them had shifted again. Now it was anticipation, not caution. There were still things unsaid, not wounds but questions, and both of them knew it was time to ask them. Jungkook stirred his coffee slowly. Did you really almost leave Korea? Taehyung nodded. I had a flight booked, Tokyo. I told the label I needed time off. They thought it was for solo work. Jungkook stared at his reflection in the dark surface of his drink. Why didn't you go? Taehyung met his gaze. Because I got a voice message from your mom the night before. Jungkook's head lifted sharply. She said, Taehyung's voice cracked. She said, don't run away from him, Taehyung. He's still in there, you both are. Just buried under everything the world turned you into. Jungkook's chest ached. She never told me. She knew I wouldn't listen if it came from anyone else. The teacups between them sat untouched as the truth settled like dust, thick and unshakable. Taehyung reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. I've been writing something, he said, sliding it across the table. Jungkook opened it. A few lines of lyrics, nothing flashy, just emotion. You looked like silence but felt like thunder. I didn't hear you until the echoes broke me. Jungkook's fingers curled around the page. I want this on the next album, Taehyung said. Not as a comeback, not as fan service, as closure. Jungkook's throat tightened, but he nodded. Let's produce it ourselves. Taehyung's smile was quiet but fierce, just us. They stayed in that cafe for hours, talking, remembering, planning. They talked about the future, not with PR strategies or marketing goals, but as people who had found a lifeline in one another and refused to let go this time. Jungkook admitted that he had been writing letters he never sent, to Taehyung, to himself, to the version of both of them that had been lost in the noise. Taehyung admitted he'd started therapy secretly, that he needed it not because of their fight, but because he realized he didn't know who he was outside of V. They both agreed on one thing. They didn't want to go back to how things were. They wanted something new, something honest, something that didn't require hiding. Days passed, then weeks. And when the group reconvened to discuss the next chapter of BTS, there was a change in the air. This time it wasn't about scaling another mountain. It was about going home, about anchoring in what truly mattered. Namjoon, as always, led the meeting, but when he asked for vision statements, it was Jungkook who spoke first. I don't want our story to be defined by survival anymore, he said. I want it to be about choosing each other, even when it's messy, especially then. Taehyung looked across the room, met his eyes and nodded. Later that week, Taehyung and Jungkook released a joint statement online, not through the label, not through management, just them. It wasn't long. It didn't explain every detail. It simply said, "There were moments when we lost sight of each other, but we never stopped carrying each other in silence. Thank you for waiting while we found our way back." The response was immediate, emotional, overwhelming, but not loud in the way it had once been. This time the love was gentler, softer, grounded. A fan posted, "I didn't need them to be perfect. I just needed to know they were okay." And finally they were. A month later, Jungkook and Taehyung stood in a small studio with a handful of staff, recording the song Taehyung had written. They titled it Thunder in the Quiet. When they sang the chorus together, the air felt thick with meaning. It was the sound of forgiveness, of rediscovery, of friendship weathered and reforged. When the final note faded, neither spoke. Jungkook just turned to Taehyung and held out his hand. Taehyung took it. And in that handshake, firm and full of memory, was a promise. Never again would they let the world silence what they could only say to each other. The morning air was laced with the scent of blooming magnolias and damp concrete, the kind of smell that only arrives in those hushed, golden hours when the city hasn't yet decided to wake fully. Taehyung walked a few steps ahead, hands in his pockets, the collar of his jacket turned up against the cold. Jungkook followed silently, phone in hand, glancing down at the freshly taken photo that now lived in his gallery. A quiet, unfiltered reminder that this moment had happened, that they had made it through the fire. No words had passed between them since that click, and yet there was no tension. Only the calm after a storm, the gentle stillness that comes when everything that needed to be broken already had been, and what remained was something that could finally breathe. As they turned down a side street toward a small cafe they had once visited years ago, back when BTS was still a whisper, not a roar, Taehyung spoke without looking back. "I dreamt about that night again." Jungkook didn't ask which night. He knew, the night everything fractured. "I was standing at the edge of the stage," Taehyung continued, "and you were behind me, but when I turned around you were walking the other way. I couldn't call out, my voice," he paused. "It didn't exist." Jungkook's breath caught. "I had that dream too," he said softly, "but in mine you looked back, and I was the one who couldn't move." They stopped walking. The street was quiet. A truck rumbled a block away, and the wind stirred faint echoes between buildings. But in that moment, all that existed was the space between them. Taehyung turned slowly. His expression was unreadable, too much emotion etched across too many memories. "I never stopped caring, Jungkook." "I know," Jungkook whispered, "but we forgot how to show it." Taehyung took a small step forward. "Do you ever wonder how different it could have been if we weren't so afraid of being watched?" "All the time." A small smile tugged at Taehyung's lips, and the lines near his eyes softened. "I think maybe we needed to break, so we could choose each other again." They resumed walking, this time closer. Their shoulders brushed occasionally, but neither pulled away. The cafe was still there, tucked between a bookstore and an apartment complex, its windows foggy from the warmth inside. A bell chimed as they stepped through the door, and an elderly woman behind the counter glanced up, recognition flickering in her eyes. She said nothing, simply nodded and motioned to their usual booth by the window. It felt like a memory had opened its arms and welcomed them home. They ordered quietly, Americano for Jungkook, Earl Grey for Taehyung. The silence between them had shifted again. Now it was anticipation, not caution. There were still things unsaid, not wounds but questions, and both of them knew it was time to ask them. Jungkook stirred his coffee slowly. "Did you really almost leave Korea?" Taehyung nodded. "I had a flight booked, Tokyo. I told the label I needed time off. They thought it was for solo work." Jungkook stared at his reflection in the dark surface of his drink. "Why didn't you go?" Taehyung met his gaze. "Because I got a voice message from your mom the night before." Jungkook's head lifted sharply. She said, Taehyung's voice cracked. She said, don't run away from him, Taehyung. He's still in there, you both are. Just buried under everything the world turned you into. Jungkook's chest ached. She never told me. She knew I wouldn't listen if it came from anyone else. The teacups between them sat untouched as the truth settled like dust, thick and unshakable. Taehyung reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. I've been writing something, he said, sliding it across the table. Jungkook opened it, a few lines of lyrics, nothing flashy, just emotion. You looked like silence but felt like thunder. I didn't hear you until the echoes broke me. Jungkook's fingers curled around the page. I want this on the next album, Taehyung said. Not as a comeback, not as fan service, as closure. Jungkook's throat tightened, but he nodded. Let's produce it ourselves. Taehyung's smile was quiet but fierce, just us. They stayed in that cafe for hours, talking, remembering, planning. They talked about the future, not with PR strategies or marketing goals, but as people who had found a lifeline in one another and refused to let go this time. Jungkook admitted that he had been writing letters he never sent, to Taehyung, to himself, to the version of both of them that had been lost in the noise. Taehyung admitted he'd started therapy secretly, that he needed it not because of their fight, but because he realized he didn't know who he was outside of V. They both agreed on one thing: they didn't want to go back to how things were. They wanted something new, something honest, something that didn't require hiding. Days passed, then weeks. And when the group reconvened to discuss the next chapter of BTS, there was a change in the air. This time it wasn't about scaling another mountain. It was about going home, about anchoring in what truly mattered. Namjoon, as always, led the meeting, but when he asked for vision statements, it was Jungkook who spoke first. I don't want our story to be defined by survival anymore, he said. I want it to be about choosing each other, even when it's messy, especially then. Taehyung looked across the room, met his eyes and nodded. Later that week, Taehyung and Jungkook released a joint statement online, not through the label, not through management, just them. It wasn't long, it didn't explain every detail. It simply said, there were moments when we lost sight of each other, but we never stopped carrying each other in silence. Thank you for waiting while we found our way back. The response was immediate, emotional, overwhelming, but not loud in the way it had once been. This time the love was gentler, softer, grounded. A fan posted, I didn't need them to be perfect. I just needed to know they were okay. And finally, they were. A month later, Jungkook and Taehyung stood in a small studio with a handful of staff, recording the song Taehyung had written. They titled it Thunder in the Quiet. When they sang the chorus together, the air felt thick with meaning. It was the sound of forgiveness, of rediscovery, of friendship weathered and reforged. When the final note faded, neither spoke. Jungkook just turned to Taehyung and held out his hand. Taehyung took it. And in that handshake, firm and full of memory, was a promise. Never again would they let the world silence what they could only say to each other. Seasons shifted without asking for permission. Spring had folded into early summer, and the days in Seoul grew warmer, brighter, as if the city itself was finally breathing again. The cherry blossoms had come and gone, their petals long swept into gutters and riverbanks, but something about their quiet, fleeting bloom still lingered in the air, like the softness between two people finally beginning again. Jungkook stood on the rooftop of HYBE's building one late afternoon, the same place he used to sneak off to during practice breaks as a trainee, back when the skyline felt impossibly big and the future even bigger. Now, with the city stretching out before him, it felt smaller somehow, not in disappointment but in intimacy. Familiar, tamed by time and experience. He leaned against the railing, hair tied messily back, sleeves rolled up, earbuds in and eyes closed. The song playing wasn't out yet. one of their unreleased tracks, the same one they'd recorded together, just the two of them, under dim studio lights and the echo of their quiet reconciliation. He knew every note by heart, not because he had edited it to perfection, but because it had come from something real, from silence turned melody, from distance turned harmony. The rooftop door creaked open behind him. He didn't need to turn. "You always find the highest place to escape," Taehyung said, stepping beside him, setting down 2 iced coffees with clinking cubes of condensed sky. "It's where the noise gets quiet," Jungkook answered, cracking one eye open to glance at him. Taehyung leaned on the rail. "Or maybe where your thoughts get louder." Jungkook chuckled softly. "Both, probably." They stood like that for a while, sipping slowly, watching the afternoon melt into amber. "I saw the message thread the label wants us to approve," Taehyung said eventually. "The one about the rebirth of Taekook." Jungkook didn't hide his sigh. "So dramatic." "They think we owe the internet an arc, a redemption, a new beginning with just enough mystery to keep fans invested." "They don't get it," Jungkook muttered. "This wasn't a comeback, it was survival." Taehyung nodded. "And we don't need to sell our healing." Jungkook looked at him then fully. "So we say no." Taehyung smiled. "We say yes to each other and no to performance." Later that evening, they sat side by side on the studio couch, surrounded by the soft glow of analog lamps and the hum of unused instruments. Taehyung had his notebook open, lyrics scribbled in every direction. Jungkook had a guitar across his lap, fingers dancing idly across the strings. "I've been thinking," Jungkook said. "Dangerous," Taehyung teased. Jungkook smirked. "I want to put together a short film, just a few minutes, us, not BTS, not idols, not V and Jungkook, just who we are now." Taehyung raised an eyebrow. "No music." "Maybe just the instrumental of the track we won't release, the one we made for us." Taehyung leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "And what would it show?" "Moments unstaged, walking by the river, cooking at your place, painting, singing in the car, just us being." Taehyung thought about it. "Do you think they'd understand it?" "I don't care," Jungkook said softly. "I think we'd understand it, that's enough." The next week, they began filming. No professional crews, just them, a camera, and the world as it looked when they weren't performing for it. The footage was raw, imperfect, beautiful. Jungkook brushing his teeth while dancing to a silent beat. Taehyung watering his plants in a ridiculous silk robe. Long car rides with the windows down, music low, eyes closed. Silent moments in bookstores, crowded streets, convenience stores at 1 a.m. where they barely said anything but were always in sync. One morning they woke before the sun and climbed Namsan Tower trails. Taehyung filmed Jungkook ahead of him, hoodie drawn up, breath visible in the early chill. When they reached the top, they didn't speak. Just filmed the city as it stretched awake beneath them, quiet and slow. And in the background, the instrumental played. No lyrics, just the sound of what healing looks like when no one is watching. They titled it Still Us. Uploaded it quietly to their shared YouTube channel, one they hadn't used in years. No fanfare, no teaser, just a post. "This is not for virality, this is for peace." The comments flooded in. Not screaming, not obsessing. Just gratitude. "Thank you for being honest. I feel less alone because of this." They never needed to be perfect, they just needed to be real. And they were. Summer unfolded gently. They spent more time together, sometimes with the others, sometimes just the two of them, sometimes saying everything, sometimes saying nothing. Jungkook started drawing again. Taehyung began learning the cello, painfully and beautifully slow. They took photos not for social media but for each other. Polaroids taped to walls, inside shoes, behind phone cases. One night in the small studio where everything had broken open months ago, they gathered again, this time with the rest of BTS. There was no agenda, just dinner, wine, music low in the background. Yoongi made fun of their art project short film. Jimin cried. Hoseok danced to it in the middle of the room with his eyes closed. Namjoon raised a glass toward them. To honesty, he said. Jungkook and Taehyung clinked their glasses quietly, a knowing glance exchanged. After dinner, the seven of them sat in a circle, shoulders touching, feet tangled, like boys, like brothers, like they had been before the world tried to mold them into something unbreakable. Where do we go from here? Jin asked, his voice gentle. Wherever we want, Jungkook said. Together, Taehyung added. No one disagreed. The moon was high by the time they left. Jungkook and Taehyung walked home. No security, no disguise, just laughter between them and the quiet confidence of men who had found their way back through fire. At a stoplight, Jungkook glanced sideways. Do you regret any of it? Taehyung didn't answer right away. I regret the silence, he finally said, but not the pause. I think we needed the distance to see each other clearly again. Jungkook nodded slowly. I missed you. Taehyung smiled. I never really left, just lost my voice for a while. The light turned green. And they walked on. Side by side. Not as a spectacle, not as an answer to a rumor, but as a truth whole and untamed. And for the first time in a long time, their steps matched the rhythm of their hearts. Still them. Still us.